next keynote speaker, Habeeb Syed, Senior Associate Attorney at Vincent Silverberg LLP. Legal considerations for launching your blockchain, NFT, or crypto project. Habeeb Syed is actually a Senior Associate Attorney, a leading national cannabis law firm. He advised startups and established companies in all matters of corporate law, including contracts, financing, M&A, securities laws matters, and tax law. A valuable resource for his client, Habeeb actually provides practical and effective legal counsel by factoring business and strategic considerations into his corporate work. In addition to general corporate work, Habeeb is experienced in advising startups, funds, investors, mining pools, and others in the cryptocurrency and blockchain space. He has helped with ICOs and other token offerings, navigating MSB and security regulation. So I can see definitely a lot of collaborations between speakers and even audiences in today. So let's welcome him to the stage.
All right, thank you. How are you all doing today? Good. Quick show of hands, how many of you are operating or working for a startup or early stage company in the Web3 space? All right, any involvement with cryptocurrency for any of you? All right, wonderful. How about NFTs? You got everything right here in a couple of these packages. So hopefully I can provide you some good information here. Legal considerations for launching your blockchain, NFT, or crypto project, pretty self-explanatory. I'm sure you're sick of hearing about a lot of this stuff. I'm sorry to bore you more with it. We'll try to keep it light and exciting, though, to the extent possible. So, when do you exactly start worrying about this? Unfortunately, from the get-go, right? For a lot of the products in the space, and I'm going to accept certain things like, let's say, cybersecurity, logistics, certain things aren't driven primarily by regulatory concerns, but when you're talking about anything in the finance space, when you're talking about certain types of NFTs, crypto at all, you're definitely looking at needing to try to structure your product and your business properly. So two different prongs to this. Your product, what exactly are you doing? And small shifts in how you characterize what you're doing can make a world of difference, right? Are you providing a payment token, or is it an access token or an access NFT? Is it you that's providing the token, or is it some Swiss or Singaporean nonprofit organization, foundation that's doing this? All of these things sort of come into play. It's a good idea to have a general sense of what you're getting into, I think, before you launch your product or get too far in. Right? You don't want to have someone tell you to hit the brakes after you spend a few $100K on developing an MVP. Questions that arise, regulatory regimes. As I mentioned, US, Switzerland, Singapore, Estonia, whatever you're talking about, there's different states here to worry about too. If you're in the US, do you maybe file in Wyoming, right? Maybe Delaware? What are you doing and why are you doing it? Relationships. You have token issuers, who owns the IP, who's the development company. A lot of different actors in this space, and you want to figure out who's doing what and why, and how your liability is separated. For example, the kind of classic thing token companies will do, you have a foundation that's issuing the token, running the ecosystem, but you have the development company in the US. It's worked for a while, quote unquote worked as in, no one's been brought up on charges yet, but
FTX, I mean,
FTX,
they should have followed this, they didn't, right?
Right, exactly. So
We assumed they did this.
You assume they did this, but even if they didn't do it, I mean, that was just pure fraud, I think.
Tom Brady said they did it, must have done it, right? Steph Curry said, I mean, it looked like they did it.
Tom Brady promised me a lot of things this season too. I don't know if I'm, yeah. Giselle, I think, is leaving him as well. I got a lot of questions about the guy now. He ended on a bad foot. But you gotta worry about these things a little bit. And again, you assume they work. I will say, though, that the government now is catching on. They're not stupid, and a lot of people in the space will say, this is ridiculous, they're requiring development companies to potentially start reporting starting next year, or starting in 2024 for transactions in 2023. They know what's going on. At the end of the day, these development companies are linked to the token issuers. You know it, I know it, regulators are catching on, and they're going to be making moves. You also have to look at liability and tax. Who owns what licenses? If you're proceeding without an MSB license, you want that overseas company handling anything related to the MSB license, right? And the biggest thing I'll say for liability is, what I'll tell most of my clients in this space is, look, most of it is gray. What we want to make sure is you're not like the fastest, brightest car on the road, speeding, right? Stay a little bit behind the guy in front of you, and we want to avoid jail at the end of the day, right? So no matter what you do the AML, do the KYC, don't get into money laundering. DeFi is a very dicey place, I'll say. I try to steer clear of that.
It's not like the law is the same with tax law. I mean, let's call a spade a spade. I mean, you're a lawyer, right? So
right.
It's not like this isn't done today. I mean, Amazon pays no taxes. There are loopholes, and you're basically saying the policy is going to essentially, at the end of the day, dictate it. And until it's there, we can take advantage of this, or we stay out of harm's way.
Exactly. So the question is, what are you willing to risk? Amazon doesn't pay taxes. It takes a very progressive approach with its tax structure. But the difference there is, tax law has been so well carved out over 100 years.
By their own people, lobbyists, sure.
Exactly. And maybe we'll get to do that in the next 50 years.
Well, but how does that affect this? How does Web 3.0, how does that intersect? You know what I mean?
Between the tax and...
Well, just because between the government, the 1% and everyone else. I mean, come on.
Right. Well, right now it doesn't necessarily intersect. You had SBF trying to make it intersect, right? Trying to push forward what I think was a ridiculous bill, the Stave Now bill. But that doesn't mean that there can't be changes moving forward. We'll get to that in a little bit, though. So, structure, entity types. So, let me start off talking about DAOs for a second. How many of you are familiar with the concept? All right. Anyone a member in any DAOs? So, there wasn't too many people that raised their hands. Quick intro, DAO, decentralized autonomous organization, right? When I hear that, it's basically like a corporation running automatically, right? Let's say if I were to issue you a token or an NFT and all the governance was done automatically through that. You have the NFT, you're going to vote, the consensus rules, etc. Now what's the problem with this? You have a decentralized organization with 10,000 people holding NFTs that are running it. Sounds like you might need an executive team. Okay, let's elect an executive team. Starts to sound a lot like a regular corporation with shareholders electing people, right? The problem with DAOs, you want to keep in mind also, they're not anything legally. And a couple of organizations ran into this trouble where they thought they were DAOs, they're okay, but at the end of the day, if you have a bunch of people engaging in any sort of enterprise together, they're considered a partnership. Partnership meaning potential personal liability. So, even if you're doing a DAO, you probably want to couch that within an entity, right? Something like an LLC, something like the DAO LLCs in Wyoming, for example, which I don't think you necessarily need, but there's a lot of ways to do this. So, depending on whether you're doing a token issuance, NFT issuance, what the utilities are, what product or service you're offering, the answers to these questions will change. What jurisdiction should you be in? What entity should you be forming? Limited companies in the BVI, foundations in Singapore or Switzerland, or corporation or LLC in the US. All can vary. And then what are the relationships between your entities? I talked about this a little already. Who owns the IP? Who's developing the product? Who's running the service? Who owns the token? Who's making investments? We saw this complicated structure to your point, sir, about with FTX, right? You had a lot of different players doing a lot of different things. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly how they organized that system.
They didn't vet.
Yeah.
KYC, KYB.
Right, exactly. And most important factor, again, I'll restate. Regulatory frameworks you have to worry about. There's a long list. but I think you can narrow it down depending on what you're doing. SEC. This is something a lot of you are familiar with. This is the sexier conversation in the room, right? Is something a security or is it not? Frankly, I agree with the SEC commissioners mostly on this. There is...
No,
No?
it's utter nonsense.
It's, sorry?
It's nonsense.
Utter nonsense that it's security.
Yeah, from a first principles perspective. If you just look at any transaction record, can you make a legal determination what's happening? You can. On the parties of the transaction.
It's difficult to make a decision.
It's impossible outside of the party, so Gary can never say something is a security. It's impossible.
We'll get to that in a second, though. If you can hold off, it's a good discussion to have. We'll get to that in just a second. Next slide, though. FINRA, Office of the Comptroller of Currency, FCC, all of these different organizations come into play in ways that we don't even understand yet. When you're talking about stable coins, when you're talking about entities acting like banks for different cryptocurrencies, a lot of these organizations can start coming into play and start clawing back their authority. To your point again, until we know what's there, until they've clarified their positions, there is gray area to operate, right? And perhaps it's better to ask for forgiveness than for permission, as long as you're not doing something that runs into FinCEN, right? You can try to navigate around securities laws. You can try to, figure out money service businesses, banking laws, etc. But when you start allowing for illicit transactions to take place, when you start taking money from people you shouldn't, you're crossing a line that goes beyond.
But they took money, the Big Short, they took money for a bet. I mean, that didn't even exist. They took money on a bet that that something was potentially going to happen. I mean, it's like they created a project, a product out of nothing. When I would put $100 million in, I think that 50,000 people are going to lose their mortgage. I have inside information, whatever. That transaction is right. That's a transaction as well.
It is, and
so the legality of it becomes. I'm curious about how that's going to be at the end of the day interpreted.
So a few different things can come into play, right? You can have the CFTC come into play. It could be a regulated future, or it could be an SEC thing. Let's talk. No, we're almost going to talk about SEC. Hold up, we're getting there. Where does blockchain fall in this? So you have cryptocurrency, you have transparency, data ownership questions, privacy laws, securities laws, real property. We were talking a little bit about that with the last presentation in terms of real property. There's questions of what a token actually is at the end of the day, right? For example, you can own a property, right? Your name is on the deed, or you own an interest in an LLC that owns a property. One of those things is a security, another one is a real property interest, right? Is the token itself almost like a bearer bond, right? Or is it just some sort of instrument tracking something, or a smart contract, right? If it's just a smart contract that executes on a transaction, then it's similar to an actual contract, perhaps an investment contract. Here we go, securities law. Now, can anyone tell me the context for these pictures here? Anyone recognize any of them?
Shall I give the entire speech or just the...
Sure, I'll give the speech, we can have a conversation.
An orange grove farmer who sold interest in that orange grove in order to convert it to other people and for a common interest, and that's what the SEC uses today as an anecdote to determine whether or not something is a security.
Right, so to recap for the people...
To be feed, by the way, by just putting in a checkbox saying, are you buying this with the expectation of profits? And that's what I ran by Hester first. And they got a stunned silence, obviously, because yes, you can just put that box in there when you send it.
You can put the box there, but here's where the rub is for many projects, right? Because, well, actually, again, I'm getting ahead of myself here. For those in the back that could not hear, the orange grove here represents Howey, which is the seminal test for whether or not something is a security. Quick background, security, in terms of the definition with the SEC, there's a bunch of things that are definitely securities. Stocks, notes, etc. Then there's this kind of catch-all that the SEC put in there called the investment contract, right? And the test for the investment contract is what was clearly outlined in Howey. quote unquote clearly, but we know the factors, right? Are you investing money with an expectation of profit based on the efforts of others? And what our friend here said was, what if I just put a checkbox saying to all the investors, you know, I am not expecting any profit on my investment, and they check that, technically that should be okay. It's a possibility. Second picture here, Wolf of Wall Street. How many have seen the movie? All right, why is this here? I like to remind people that there's a reason these rules are in place. It's not spite. The government is just not looking to crack down on businesses and be mean to everyone. It might be corrupt, there might be loopholes and stuff for people, but at the end of the day, the purpose of the SEC is to protect investors, right? Early on, back in 2017, 2018, when I would do crypto conferences, people would ask, why does the SEC feel that people who make less than $200K a year or don't have $1 million in assets, right, aren't accredited investors, cannot make their own investments, can't make their own decisions, right? Because they're less capable of doing so. At the end of the day, people with less assets, less money, are one, more likely to be able to be convinced to make a bad investment.
Explain that you need to be an accredited investor, and so to be an accredited investor, it's like know your business, know your customer. So an accredited investor is, they look at we did it too, and they look at all the documentation historically of the organization, and then, and they determine whether you personally, with your assets, are good enough to be an investor, and then you have the privilege of giving money.
Exactly, you suddenly have access to more investments.
And it's different in Canada than it is in the US, and there's some differences and blah, blah, blah.
Different things everywhere, but similar concepts at the end of the day. Because the point is, people with less money are gonna have a worse time if they lose it and do need more protection, right? This is why this picture is there, to remind us there's a reason for these laws. Delving a little bit more. The example I like to use is Chuck E. Cheese.
Love it.
Right? Now, when is something a security, when is it not? Let's say I'm opening up a Chuck E. Cheese. I'm gonna sell you my Chuck E. Cheese token so you can come and play when I open up the Chuck E. Cheese a year from now on the different machines, right? Skee ball or whatever. I mean, personally, I think it's basically gambling, but let's look past the gambling laws for a second. Sorry?
It's playing, not necessarily gambling.
We'll go with playing. We'll go with playing. I know people that have lost a lot of money at Chuck E. Cheese, though. But if I'm doing that, that's fine, right? That reminds me of Kickstarter, for example. How many of you have contributed to a Kickstarter campaign, right? You're just pre-purchasing something that you're going to use later. You're going to get later and you can use. Technically okay. Now, what if you suddenly introduce a market where people can buy and sell tokens? This starts to get into your question. Even if I check the box, what is happening? And what we used to do with white papers and communications and publications and everything for projects 3-4 years ago was, okay, to your point, yes, you want to have something that says very clearly, not an expectation of profits, right? That doesn't exist. Checker initial is a very good idea for that. But what is the reality at the end of the day, right? Unfortunately, too many emails, too many notes from meetings that state, hey, you're going to make a killing on this. Price is going to go up. You know, this is the representation that was made. Those things will sink the ship. Suddenly you have an expectation of profits. People are buying this not to use, right, in the future at the Chuck E. Cheese, but because I think I can buy this token now and sell it later for 10x, right? Again, this kind of comes to how much do we want to hide the ball, right? People in the industry know that 99% of the transactions are taking place for the purposes of profit. No regulators in the room, so I'm going to say this, right? We don't have to worry about it. But between us, we know that's the case. Most of the trading is not happening for utility, right? I might go and use my ETH after I buy it, but how much of my ETH have I used and how much am I holding? How much will I probably never use? Most of it, right? My hope is eventually one day it's going to get to a point where people have to use it, and then they'll come to me to buy it, right? Right now, that bet is not paying off for me, as I'm sure is the case for many of you. But this is the reality of the ecosystem we live in, right? So, moving on. Token with initial utility without a market, right? I have the Chuck E. Cheese open, I'm selling my tokens. You can't go buy and sell tokens, but you can use them on the machines. Perfectly fine again, right? Token with initial utility with a market. BNB, Ether, all of these things fall into that category. And the SEC doesn't know what to do there exactly.
You can use the machine. So I need you to repeat this. You can use the machine, then that's just a service, right? So why can't it be, that I'm providing an authorization, an authentication, like a service? Why can't I do the same thing? If they can put a token in and have experience with the machine, why can't it just be a service that we provide?
It's a good question, right? So the SEC doesn't know what to do here. Where it does run into an issue potentially is money service business laws. We'll get into that in a second. But if you're just using BNB, right, you're paying 0.01 or whatever to conduct a transaction on the Binance blockchain, why is that a problem just because you can also trade it? We don't know where that falls. SEC is still trying to figure that out. Probably okay, frankly, at the end of the day, is where I'm thinking this is going to end up, right? But there's questions of how much utility also exists. So let's say I've built half my Chuck E. Cheese, I'm selling tokens, but I'm going to use the money that I've raised from tokens to build up out the next half of the Chuck E. Cheese. Again, this comes into a problem, right? On some cases, the SEC has decided if you don't only have one machine in the Chuck E. Cheese and you're using the rest of the money raised to build out the other 99 machines, probably a security, right? If there's a market out there as well. If you have 50 machines built out and you're raising to build the remaining 50, probably not a security, right? We have both ends on it, and there's a gradient in between where there's maybe a little bit of wiggle room. NFTs. Now, where do they fall, right? Because they're non-fungible tokens. It shouldn't be nearly the same thing. Again, my opinion, just us in the room, it's just another layer of abstraction at the end of the day, right? What is the point of these NFTs? Having worked on a lot of these projects, at the end of the day, you're raising money, you're trying to build something, there's going to be utility, right? Where do the NFTs kind of try to take a stance here? We're selling a product at the end of the day, right? This is like a digital trading card. It's like an action figure, whatever. It's a good that we're selling. We happen to be raising money. We're not even not delivering right off the bat, right? This isn't the case where there's going to be future utility. You bought the NFT, here it is, here's your utility, you get to take a look at it, right? You get to own it. That's it, you're good. That's a more difficult thing to contend with. I think regulators are going to try to figure out some way to approach it because there's a lot of shady stuff going on in the markets, right? You see people sweeping the floor on these, a lot of insiders doing that kind of activity. But again, should we really regulate it? Is it just up to the people? If a certain Nike shoe goes on sale and Nike happens to be, sponsoring third parties to purchase the lowest selling ones so that they keep raising the price, is that something we really need to protect consumers from? Maybe we look to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, try to get someone to look at whether or not this is proper rather than have a complex regulatory regime here, right? That might be the way to go. When you look at NFTs that are generating tokens and things like that, again, you go back into the token analysis that we just spoke about and things get a lot more complicated. You're probably running into problems. Potential fallout from that. So for example, the apes and the ape coins, right? Again, they use different structures to make it removed from the NFT technically, but at the end of the day, you have an NFT, you're getting tokens. Now, the NFT technically, at this point, is a contract, smart contract that you purchase that entitles you to the right to receive these tokens which have value, right? Question about whether or not you purchased it initially with the expectation of profit or not, debatable perhaps. But if some of these NFTs are tokens, which many are, I'll say, in my opinion, OpenSea, right, salon art, whatever it is you're using, runs into problems of potentially operating as an unlicensed exchange. And where are we at right now with time? I'm going slowly here. We'll keep moving. FinCEN, AML and KYC. We talked about this. No, thank you, appreciate that. We talked about the AML and KYC considerations, super important. At the end of the day, the other stuff, look, you're trying your best, you're working in good faith, you're not the fastest car, brightest car in the room, you're taking things a little slowly, trying to figure things out, wonderful. You run afoul of these people though, you have a problem. Keep that in mind. Money service businesses. This is potentially the broadest area of law when it comes to tokens. NFTs, you know, I'll avoid delving into that for now, but it's the broadest area of law when it comes to tokens. It distinguishes between administrators, exchangers, and users. Now, if you're just a user, you're okay. I buy ETH, I use it to pay for something, that's fine, right? Let's say I hire you to do a project for me, I pay you an ETH, I'm fine, you're fine, right? Now, if you have created a company and you've created your own token, technically you might be an administrator of that token, depending on the authority you have. Perhaps you're not an administrator to the extent you've decentralized the issuance and governance stuff, right? We're looking at this issue with, for example, ETH and a lot of different DAOs that operate DeFi tokens and platforms. So still a developing area of law, still the area I think that has provided us the most context for actually how to navigate as best they can, but also the broadest sweeping, because you have to look at all these ancillary service providers in this space, right? I've done analysis for mining pools, for wallets, for different players in the industry that are wondering whether or not they technically might count as an administrator, an exchange, or an exchanger, or we can try to find a way to put them into the user space. And if you're curious, there's been a few FinCEN letters that have come out, one in 2015 on convertible virtual currencies, and another, I think in 2019 or 2020, that was much more comprehensive and can provide a lot of good information on this. How does it work with non-US issuers? We don't know, frankly, right? You're talking about, let's say, BNB's, Binance's Singaporean Foundation. How does it interact with US securities law and US FinCEN law? We don't really know how the foundation reacts. The exchanges on which BNB is sold, or on which any token is sold, are all registered, though, as money service businesses. Or they should be, and they're screwed if they're not, right? Now, the one exception here are decentralized finance organizations. I'm not bullish on these in general. I see the utility. I think most of them right now are glorified Ponzi schemes, but I definitely see the utility moving forward. The problem is it's hard to be decentralized and be in compliance, right? These things conflict sometimes, and I'm hoping that's something we can figure out. NFTs. This is my OK Bear. I used to have a much nicer one. This one was rarer, so I swapped out. Terrible decision, I think it looks terrible. But hopefully it's worth a little bit more money. Are NFTs stupid and pointless? Show of hands. Are NFTs stupid and pointless? Who thinks they are stupid and pointless? All right, not too many people here. This is not the crowd that would think they are. I think there's a lot of utility there, right? Are the PFP projects, profile picture projects, potentially stupid and pointless? I'd say so, maybe. I still bought into a lot of them because I was looking to make money. But exactly, exactly.
The idea of the NFT market is that you don't only buy the NFTs, the utility is essentially that the value of being in the community of buying it at a certain rate.
Exactly.
And then also that the value of it will go up so that you can actually resale.
That is the hope. I've bought a couple though purely because of utility. I bought into NFT.com, Kevin O'Leary's project. Terrible decision on my part, but actual utility, right? And so NFTs as tickets, as, you know, access cards, token gated situations, I think that is a wonderful idea. NFTs in gaming, amazing.
Yeah, but I do want to say the broader definition of an NFT that we're really looking at when we do an NFT as a license or ownership, more of a, like a documentation of ownership, especially for media and entertainment, like video, for example. If you own a video and you're an artist, then you can verify that you own something and you can share it out and have great use cases for being an NFT that have not been explored in this model today.
Right. Wonderful. Authentication first and foremost. And that's the thing. You buy a Van Gogh, right? How do you know it's real? You don't. You can buy a copy, just like someone can take a screenshot of my OK Bear. I can buy a copy of a Van Gogh that looks almost exactly the same, arguably better, right? We won't get into that argument. But
Use the Santa Claus one. We all get pictures of Santa Claus. I want the real Santa Claus.
no one's got the real Santa Claus.
I want the real one. Right?
But yes, if you have an NFT, you know who the real Santa Claus is.
Because he signed it. He's the one from the North Pole. That's the one I got.
Exactly. You got, but now to the point here, you have to trust the organization as well, because you can have a Santa Claus on Binance, you could have a Santa Claus on Ethereum, on Solana, or whatever, right? Now who's the real Santa Claus?
So if you have a decentralized platform, truly, that's not really on the crypto, not really on a third-party platform of any kind, but your own, then you can authenticate it, and that's a lot more, and a lot more trust in the system.
There is, but I think it's overblown. Here's why. At the end of the day, let's say I make something, you make something, they look similar, we dispute who actually came up with the idea. I issue it on a fully decentralized platform. Trustworthy, very trustworthy. You do the same thing. At the end of the day,
Time date stamp, no?
time and date stamp, what do those dictate? When we put them on the chain though, right?
Why not like a trademark or patent application?
Exactly. At the end of the day, you're still operating in the real world, and you have to look at who owns the IP and the blockchain. Not yet, anyways, not until the US government implements it into the USPTO. The blockchain is not right now an indication of who owns the IP, right? You owning the NFT is not even an indication of your right to use the NFT for various purposes. That's why terms and conditions are very
Yeah, but
important.
at the end of the day, I have the key to her post office box. I walk in and I'm entitled to whatever I get in the box, no?
No.
How come?
And this is the question, that I mentioned the bearer bond, for example, right? You might have the key, but the legal right to the box is still hers, right? And she can prove that. Now, it might come to a point where the key is indisputable evidence of who owns it.
Satoshi doesn't exist, because if he did, I think he's 6 feet under, God rest his soul, but I think he had the private keys. The point is that if the key ceased to exist, so does what it points at. At the end of the day, the private key, just like our primary keys, is our way of identifying and authenticating people. So the decentralized identity, an NFT is nothing more than a product. I mean, if you want to buy crap, whatever you want to put it, whatever you want it to be, right?
Right.
But
Nothing, it's
legally-
nothing but a product. The question is, what is the product actually, what is the product, right? Because the product, you and I both know, we didn't pay for a picture, right? There was supposed to be something that went with it. And the only way to know what goes with that picture are the contractual rights that you're actually granted, right? And those could be encoded in the smart contract. More than likely, though, they're just in some terms and use that you probably haven't read, right? I'm a lawyer. I did not read my OK Bear terms and conditions. I probably should have before this, could have told you something about it, but that's just the reality at the end of the day. So you don't know what you own. Eventually, as this is more integrated into society, having the key might mean something, but right now I'm glad it doesn't, right? Because at the end of the day, there's more theft in the blockchain industry than the regular financial system at the moment.
Defense and debt strategy means that what you're getting, the assets that you're getting in there, are wrapped in a way that, okay, so you have the contract or the deed, and you're not just getting the deed, but you're still using defense and debt to get that. I mean, that's the way it has to be done. whatever the asset is, it has to be able to be retrievable and verifiable, so.
Exactly, right? And maybe we get to the point where I feel safer doing that. Right now, if my account gets hacked or someone finds my keys, I want to be able to recover that. I'm sorry, I'm not saying you have my keys. I guess it's all yours, go ahead. I was stupid, my fault, please. I mean, yes, I was stupid, yes, my fault, but I still want my money, right?
Same thing as when you lose your credit card.
Exactly, exactly the same thing. So, depending on the industry you're involved in, other laws and regulations might also come into play. I'm with Vicente Skeeterberg. We do a lot of cannabis stuff, #1 cannabis firm in the country. I've been working with a lot of different companies on how cannabis and NFTs or cannabis and crypto can come into play. A lot of interesting stuff out there to navigate. Privacy, insurance, healthcare. I'm sure some of you are doing a lot of different projects in these specific areas, and they all have all, their own considerations that are going to come into play. What can you do as an innovator, right? I'm just a lawyer. Most of you in the room here are actually doing something creative, right? Do your research. Don't look for loopholes, sorry to say, but try to understand policy, right? Once you understand policy, you can navigate the gray a little bit better. Do your, do good faith solutions. Then look for creative solutions. There we go.
Listen, man, I'm not doing the loopholes, it's the 1%.
No,
I'm paying my taxes.
no regulars in the room. It's okay. We can talk honestly.
Come on, I'm paying taxes.
Permission versus forgiveness. Sometimes, forgiveness is better. Sometimes permission is better. If you want to do something that's a little bit out there and you have a path, you can always talk to regulators. They are open. They're busy, but they are open to having these conversations. Sometimes in the US, it's not as much the case. I was working early on in 2017 with a blockchain securitization company. That was my entry into the space. They left the US and went to the UAE because they had a nice sandbox there. They were able to talk to regulators. They were able to figure out how it goes, and they're doing very well now. Back then, I think they could have approached this because they were very early on in the space back then, but sometimes the US might not be the best place to do this, right? And then finally, good faith and best practices. That is important, right? At the end of the day, if what you're looking to show is that number one, you don't want to go to jail. Number two, I wanted to comply. I did the best I could based on what I see others doing, right? You haven't shut down Binance. You haven't shut down Ethereum. I was just trying to model off them, right? Why don't you sue them and then you tell me that I can't do this? But until you have, I think I'm good. And what I'll tell people is, look, worst case scenario, what we're looking to make the worst case scenario is, maybe you have to pay fines. Maybe you have to shut down your business. But there shouldn't be anything that comes back on you personally.
It only hurts startups, not large companies. The slaps on the wrist, $500 million doesn't hurt them.
Fines, though, that's why forgiveness rather than permission, because all of these were startups, right? Block, it paid $20 million a few years after it raised money, but they were a startup a couple of years before that. Same thing with Ripple. Same thing with Binance, who's going to end up having to pay. All these companies were startups, right? And maybe you manage to get to a point when you're asking for forgiveness, you're able to foot the bill. Maybe not, but at the least, you don't want to end up on some sort of bad actor list. You don't want to end up paying fines. You don't want to end up in jail, right? You can always reiterate. You can always launch something again after that, but we want to avoid these things. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I don't know if we have time for questions.
Maybe like one question?
All right, anyone have any questions here? We had a nice lively discussion, so maybe there's nothing left to be said. All right, if there's no questions, then thank you very much.